Welcome to Tomorrow Unveiled, where the future isn't just predicted, it's explained. So here's something you might have missed while scrolling through the news. America is in the middle of a nuclear expansion unlike anything we've seen in decades. I'm not talking about some distant future scenario. I'm talking about what's happening right now, in boardrooms, in state capitals, and in laboratories across the country. And it's not just nuclear. Renewables are expanding. The grid is being modernized. Supply chains are being rebuilt. Workforce programs are launching. It's all happening at the same time, and it's all connected in ways that most people don't realize. Here's the thing. When you pull back and look at the big picture, you realize that America's energy future isn't being built by accident. It's being built by design. Federal executive orders, state initiatives, financing mechanisms, regulatory reform, they're all moving in the same direction, and today we're going to connect all those dots. Let's start with the headline that caught everyone's attention. In May of 2025, President Trump signed 4 executive orders on nuclear energy. 4, and they weren't minor tweaks to existing policy. They were comprehensive, sweeping directives that touched every part of the nuclear ecosystem. The headline number? Quadrupling U.S. nuclear capacity by 2050. Let me say that again. Quadrupling. That's not a suggestion. That's 300 gigawatts of new nuclear generation on top of what we have right now. To visualize that, we're talking about more than 300 large nuclear reactors worth of new capacity. But here's what makes this different from previous nuclear pushes. These orders aren't just aspirational. They're operational. They set specific timelines. They identify funding mechanisms. They name the agencies responsible. They include deadlines, some as tight as 30 days, others extending to 2030 and beyond. One order specifically targets the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It's demanding regulatory reform, streamlined licensing processes, and an 18-month deadline for new reactor approvals. That might not sound dramatic, but in the nuclear world, that's revolutionary. Licensing used to take a decade or more. Another order focuses on fuel supply. It's directing the Department of Energy to develop domestic uranium enrichment capacity, establish agreements with private companies for fuel supply, and even process excess plutonium into usable fuel for advanced reactors. That's essentially saying we're going to rebuild the entire nuclear fuel cycle domestically. A third order targets the DOE's national laboratories and military installations. It's directing the construction of at least 3 new test reactors by July 2026, and it's calling for advanced reactors to be deployed at DOE sites to power AI data centers, which is a fascinating intersection of energy and technology. The fourth order focuses on exports and global nuclear leadership. It's directing the State Department to pursue 20 new nuclear cooperation agreements with foreign countries. It's mobilizing the Export-Import Bank, the International Development Finance Corporation, and the Trade and Development Agency to support U.S. nuclear exports. So we've got domestic deployment, fuel supply, regulatory reform, and global exports all being pushed simultaneously. That's coordination on a scale we haven't seen in nuclear policy in a very long time. But federal ambition alone doesn't build nuclear plants. You need states to step up, and that's exactly what Illinois is doing. In February 2026, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker signed an executive order specifically targeting new nuclear capacity. The goal? 2 gigawatts of new nuclear generation by the early 2030s. 2 gigawatts. That's roughly equivalent to 2 large nuclear reactors, or potentially a fleet of smaller advanced reactors. In a state that already generates more electricity from nuclear than any other state in the nation, 53% of its total electricity in 2024. Now, Illinois isn't starting from scratch on nuclear. The state has a long history. It's home to Enrico Fermi's groundbreaking work on the first controlled nuclear chain reaction back in 1942 at the University of Chicago. It currently operates 6 nuclear power plants with 11 reactors. So there's expertise, there's infrastructure, and there's political will. But Pritzker's executive order goes beyond just saying yes to nuclear. It's actually setting up the machinery to make it happen. It's directing the Illinois Power Agency and the Illinois Commerce Commission to issue what's called a Notice of Inquiry. basically an open call asking potential nuclear developers, what would it take for you to build here? They're asking developers about technology types, financing options, potential sites, interconnection availability, workforce needs, waste management plans, and community benefits. They're even specifically asking about equity investment in communities that haven't historically benefited from energy development. Then, and this is important, the state is issuing a second notice of inquiry directed at communities. Which communities would be interested in hosting a nuclear facility? What sites have the land, the water, the interconnection infrastructure, and the community support? That's different from the old approach to nuclear siting, where decisions were often made top down. This is asking for community engagement upfront. The state is also creating an interagency working group that includes the Illinois Commerce Commission, the Illinois Power Agency, the Department of Commerce, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Labor, and the University of Illinois. These agencies have 120 days to produce a report identifying what legislative changes, regulatory reforms, and procurement procedures might be needed, and they're tasking the Department of Commerce with developing a nuclear energy supply chain report, identifying which Illinois companies could expand and grow to support nuclear manufacturing and construction. So, Illinois isn't just hoping for nuclear development, it's actively building the infrastructure, institutional, regulatory, and economic, to make it real. Building nuclear plants, it's not just physics and financing. You need places where you can actually build them. That's where siting comes in. The NRC has detailed siting guidance, technical criteria for what makes a location suitable. But here's the challenge. Siting a nuclear plant takes years, sometimes decades, of environmental reviews, geological surveys, and community engagement. That's been one of the biggest bottlenecks in nuclear development. The federal executive orders and Illinois' state order are both addressing this, but in different ways. The federal orders are pushing regulatory streamlining, reducing the time and complexity of NRC review processes. They're also calling for better coordination between the NRC and the regional transmission organizations that manage the grid, because there's no point in building a nuclear plant if you can't connect it to the grid. Illinois is taking a different approach. It's basically asking, where in Illinois could this actually work? And it's doing that through community engagement up front, rather than imposing sites from above. Here's why that matters. Siting failures have killed nuclear projects in the past. You can have the best reactor design and the best financing. But if the community doesn't want it, or if the site isn't suitable, the project dies. So the state is trying to identify sites where there's genuine potential, where there's community interest, where the infrastructure exists, where the land and water are available. The federal framework is also addressing a specific technical challenge: interconnection. The RTO, the Regional Transmission Organization, manages the grid and determines how new generation can connect. Currently, there's a massive backlog of interconnection requests. Renewable projects, battery storage projects, and nuclear projects are all waiting in queues. Some have been waiting years. The orders are directing the agencies to work with the RTOs to improve these processes. That might mean expedited interconnection pathways for nuclear, or it might mean improving the interconnection studies themselves so they don't take forever. So you've got federal regulatory reform, state-level siting engagement, and grid coordination all happening in parallel. That's the framework that's supposed to enable the Illinois nuclear expansion. Here's where it gets really interesting. You might think that pushing nuclear this hard would mean pushing renewables to the side. That's not what's happening. Solar and wind are continuing to expand at record rates. The U.S. renewable energy capacity additions in 2025 set new records. And the policy support for renewables isn't slowing down. It's accelerating. In fact, there's a sophisticated understanding at both the federal and state level that you need both. You need nuclear for reliable baseload power, the constant steady electricity that runs all the time. You need renewables for their rapid deployment and cost effectiveness. And you need them to work together. That's why the federal orders specifically mention nuclear renewable hybrid systems. These aren't futuristic concepts. They're actual designs where nuclear plants and renewable installations are co-located or integrated. The nuclear provides the stable power. The renewables provide additional capacity. Together, they're more flexible and more resilient than either alone. In Illinois, this is playing out through the Illinois Power Agency's procurement processes. The IPA filed its 2026 Long-Term Renewable Resources Plan, which was approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission. This plan is procuring 1.58 gigawatts of renewable energy, wind and solar, over the next several years. So you've got Illinois saying, we're going to add 2 gigawatts of nuclear, and simultaneously, we're procuring 1.5 gigawatts of renewables. That's 3.6 gigawatts of new clean energy capacity in one state. And here's the philosophical shift that's happening. It's not nuclear versus renewables anymore. It's nuclear and renewables. They're complementary technologies in a clean energy mix. That's not ideology, that's engineering. That's grid reliability. The federal outlook for renewables is equally bullish. The Department of Energy's funding announcements for emerging energy technologies are supporting everything from next-generation solar to offshore wind to geothermal. The investment is broad and it's substantial. Okay, so we've got ambitious targets. Nuclear in Illinois, renewables everywhere. But how do you actually pay for this? That's where federal support becomes crucial. The Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office is a key player here. This office has the authority to provide loan guarantees for energy projects. For the Vogtle nuclear expansion in Georgia, Units 3 and 4, the DOE provided $12 billion in loan guarantees. Those plants are now operational, and they cost over $36 billion total. The nuclear orders are specifically directing the Loan Programs Office to prioritize nuclear projects. They're also proposing $750 million in credit subsidies specifically for small modular reactors and advanced nuclear reactors in the FY 2026 budget. But loans alone don't work. You also need tax credits. The Inflation Reduction Act created technology-neutral clean energy tax credits. Essentially, they pay a portion of the cost of building clean energy infrastructure. Nuclear qualifies. So do renewables. So does grid infrastructure. Here's the thing, though, and this is where it gets complicated. Congress is debating changes to these tax credits. There's discussion about eliminating the transferability provision, which would make it harder for nuclear projects to access the credits. There's also discussion about foreign entity restrictions, which could complicate supply chains. So the funding mechanisms exist, but they're not guaranteed to stay in place. That's creating some uncertainty for project developers. At the state level, Illinois is using different mechanisms. The state has the ability to support nuclear development through procurement contracts, essentially signing long-term agreements to purchase the electricity from new nuclear plants. That's how the renewable procurement works. And it could work for nuclear too. The state is also looking at what it calls clean energy credits, financial incentives that could support nuclear development. These would be part of the state's integrated resource planning process, which is the comprehensive approach to determining what kinds of energy resources the state needs. So the funding picture is complex. There's federal support through loans and tax credits. There's state support through procurement and credits. There are private investors who see nuclear as a good long-term investment. But there are also gaps, places where the financing still doesn't quite work. And that's one of the reasons why supply chain development is so critical. Here's what nobody talks about. You can't build gigawatts of clean energy without actually manufacturing all the components. And America's manufacturing base is, well, let's just say it's been neglected. The supply chain for nuclear is particularly concentrated. There are only a handful of companies that can manufacture reactor vessels, steam generators, and other major components. Most of that manufacturing has moved overseas or is controlled by foreign companies. So when you're trying to build 300 gigawatts of new capacity and you want it to be American, that's a real problem. The federal orders are addressing this directly. They're calling for the Department of Commerce to develop supply chain reports to identify bottlenecks and to support domestic manufacturing expansion. They're also directing funding toward nuclear-related manufacturing and apprenticeships. Illinois is doing something similar. The state's executive order specifically tasks the Department of Commerce with developing a nuclear energy supply chain report by September 2026. This report is supposed to identify which Illinois companies are positioned to expand in nuclear manufacturing, whether that's for reactor components, construction services, or support equipment. The state is also considering funding a nuclear energy supply chain manufacturing training academy. That's not a small thing. That's saying we're going to invest in training people to work in nuclear manufacturing. Here's the economic development angle. Nuclear manufacturing is high-wage work. These aren't minimum wage jobs. Manufacturing reactor components, building nuclear plants, operating them, these are skilled trades with good pay. So there's an economic development incentive, not just an energy incentive, but there's also a national security angle. The orders explicitly frame this as a national security issue. If America depends on foreign companies for critical nuclear components, that's a vulnerability. So the push for domestic supply chains is partly about economic development and partly about reducing dependence on countries that might not always be friendly. The renewable supply chain has similar challenges, by the way. Most solar panels are manufactured in Asia. Wind turbines have supply chain dependencies. Battery manufacturing is ramping up in the US, but it's still developing. So the supply chain issue isn't unique to nuclear. It's a broader clean energy challenge. But because nuclear is the focus right now, and because nuclear manufacturing is so concentrated, the supply chain work feels more urgent. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this dive into America's energy future, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. We've got some fascinating stories coming up. Let's talk about what makes next-generation nuclear different and why fuel supply is such a big deal. Many advanced reactors use high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU. We don't produce it domestically. The orders are directing the DOE to establish agreements with private companies to supply it. That's essentially creating a whole new domestic industry from scratch. Why does this matter? Because if you're going to build dozens or hundreds of small modular reactors, which are one of the most promising advanced reactor designs, you need a reliable fuel supply. And if that fuel supply doesn't exist, the whole project stalls. The orders are also addressing spent nuclear fuel recycling. Currently, the U.S. treats spent fuel as waste. It's stored at reactor sites, waiting for a permanent repository that's been politically impossible to build. But spent fuel actually contains valuable material that could be recycled and used in new reactors. The orders are directing the DOE to identify all U.S. uranium and plutonium stockpiles that could be recycled, and to authorize construction of a fuel recycling facility. That's a significant shift in how America thinks about nuclear fuel. For advanced reactors specifically, the orders are calling for DOE to provide at least 20 metric tons of HALEU to any project sited at a DOE facility that will power AI infrastructure. So the federal government isn't just setting targets. It's actually providing the fuel to make it happen. This is important because it removes one major barrier to advanced reactor deployment. Developers don't have to worry, will I be able to get fuel? The government is saying, yes, we'll supply it. Many companies are already moving forward with advanced reactor designs. Companies like Oklo, TerraPower, X-Energy, and others are designing and building small modular reactors and other advanced designs. Some are targeting deployment dates in the late 2020s and early 2030s. The federal fuel supply commitment makes those timelines more realistic. So you've got regulatory reform, siting engagement, financing mechanisms, supply chain development, and now fuel supply, all being addressed simultaneously. That's coordination. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The grid itself is the bottleneck. America's electrical grid is aging. It was designed for centralized generation. Big power plants in one place sending electricity out to consumers. But the future energy system is decentralized. You've got solar on rooftops, wind farms in remote locations, battery storage scattered around, and new nuclear plants coming online. All of that needs to connect to the grid. All of it needs to be coordinated. The regional transmission organizations, the RTOs that manage the grid, are overwhelmed. There are thousands of projects in the interconnection queue waiting to connect. Some have been waiting for years. The interconnection studies alone can take 18 months or more. The federal orders are directing the agencies to work with the RTOs to improve this. That might mean streamlining the interconnection studies. It might mean creating expedited pathways for certain projects. It might mean investing in grid upgrades to create more capacity. Illinois is specifically addressing this too. The state's executive order directs the ICC to work with the impacted utilities and the RTOs to secure interconnection for new nuclear projects. That's not trivial. In some cases, interconnection is the limiting factor for whether a project happens. Grid security is also becoming more important. As the grid becomes more decentralized and more dependent on variable renewable energy, it becomes more vulnerable to disruptions, whether from natural disasters, cyber attacks, or just the complexity of managing millions of devices. The federal government is investing in grid security and modernization. That's part of the energy infrastructure push. So you've got new generation being added, nuclear and renewables. And simultaneously, you've got the grid being upgraded and secured. That's the only way this works. You can't just keep adding generation without upgrading the grid to handle it. The investment in grid infrastructure is substantial. Bloomberg NEF estimated that global grid investment could top $470 billion in 2025. The U.S. share of that is significant, and that investment is critical to making the clean energy transition actually work. All of this infrastructure, nuclear plants, renewable installations, grid upgrades, requires people, a lot of people. And right now there's a workforce gap. The federal orders are directing the Department of Labor and Department of Education to increase participation in nuclear energy-related apprenticeships and education programs. They're making nuclear energy careers a priority area for federal investment. They're directing the DOE to increase university access to the national laboratories for research and development. Illinois is doing something similar. The state's executive order tasks the Department of Commerce with assessing workforce needs for nuclear facility construction and operation. The state is considering funding a nuclear energy supply chain manufacturing training academy. Here's the scale of what we're talking about. If Illinois adds 2 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity, that's not a handful of jobs. That's thousands of construction jobs during the building phase and hundreds of permanent operating jobs. And that's just Illinois. Multiply that across the country if the federal targets are met. These aren't low-wage jobs. Nuclear plant operators are highly skilled. Nuclear construction workers are skilled trades. Manufacturing reactor components requires technical expertise, so you're talking about good-paying jobs. The economic development impact goes beyond just the jobs at the nuclear plant itself. There's the supply chain, manufacturing, transportation, construction services. There's the community impact, increased tax revenue, demand for local services. There's the workforce development ecosystem, training programs, education partnerships. For states like Illinois that have experienced industrial decline, this is significant. Nuclear development could be an economic anchor, attracting skilled workers, attracting investment, creating a hub of expertise. But here's the challenge. You can't just announce that you want workers. You have to invest in training. You have to partner with unions and apprenticeship programs. You have to make sure the training is available in the communities where people actually live. That takes time and coordination. The orders in the state executive action are recognizing this. They're not just saying build it, they're saying build it and invest in the people who will work in it. That's a lesson learned from previous energy transitions. When industries change, workers can be left behind. The emphasis on workforce development suggests that policymakers are trying to avoid that mistake this time. So let's step back and see the whole picture. You've got federal executive orders setting targets. Quadruple nuclear, massively expand renewables, modernize the grid. Illinois is actually implementing a concrete plan to add 2 gigawatts of nuclear capacity. Renewable energy procurement is happening in parallel. Federal funding mechanisms are being deployed. Supply chains are being rebuilt. Workers are being trained. It's coordinated. That's the key word, coordinated. This isn't a bunch of separate initiatives happening randomly. It's a comprehensive strategy with multiple components all supporting each other. The nuclear expansion requires fuel supply, which the orders are establishing. It requires regulatory reform, which the orders are mandating. It requires financing, which the Loan Programs Office and tax credits are providing. It requires sites, which Illinois is identifying through community engagement. It requires workforce, which training programs are developing. It requires supply chain, which manufacturing initiatives are building. The renewable expansion is following a parallel track with its own financing mechanisms, its own procurement processes, its own supply chain development. The grid modernization is enabling both nuclear and renewables to connect and function reliably. Now, here's the honest assessment. There are still gaps. The financing still doesn't fully work for all projects. The supply chain is still developing. The regulatory path is still being refined. The workforce training is still ramping up. There are political uncertainties. Congress could change the tax credits, could cut funding, could shift priorities. But the trajectory is clear. America is making a deliberate choice to expand nuclear energy, to continue expanding renewables, and to modernize the grid. And it's doing it in a coordinated way that suggests policymakers understand how these pieces fit together. For someone watching this from outside the US, this probably looks like a significant shift. America spent decades with limited nuclear development. The last new reactor to begin operation was in 2016. Now, suddenly, there are executive orders, state initiatives, financing mechanisms, and supply chain investments all aligned toward nuclear expansion. For someone inside the US, the question is whether this actually delivers results. Will Illinois get its 2 gigawatts of new nuclear? Will the federal targets be met? Will the regulatory reforms actually speed up licensing? Will the supply chain expand fast enough? Will the workforce be ready? Those are empirical questions that'll be answered over the next 5 to 10 years. But the machinery is being built right now to make it possible. Oh, and if you're watching on your phone, there's a hype button right below the video. Smashing that really helps smaller channels like ours get discovered. And if you're listening on a podcast platform, leaving a review or sharing this with someone interested in energy policy makes a huge difference. Here's the thing that's easy to miss when you're looking at all the details. This is simultaneously an energy policy, an economic development strategy, and a national security strategy. On the energy side, the goal is clear. Decarbonize the electricity system while maintaining reliability and affordability. Nuclear and renewables together can do that. They're both zero carbon. They're both increasingly cost competitive. They can be deployed at scale. On the economic development side, this is about rebuilding American manufacturing and creating high-wage jobs. Nuclear manufacturing, renewable manufacturing, battery manufacturing, grid equipment manufacturing. These are all being supported through federal and state investment. That's explicitly about reshoring economic activity that moved overseas. On the national security side, this is about reducing dependence on foreign supply chains and establishing global leadership in clean energy technologies. If America is the leader in nuclear reactor design, nuclear fuel supply, and renewable technology, that's geopolitical leverage. It's also about energy independence, not being reliant on other countries for critical energy infrastructure. The orders make all of this explicit. They talk about national security throughout. They frame nuclear as a strategic technology. They call for domestic supply chains. They emphasize global export and leadership. So when you see Illinois pursuing 2 gigawatts of new nuclear, it's not just about Illinois' electricity needs. It's part of a broader national strategy to expand nuclear energy and establish leadership in that sector. When you see federal investment in advanced reactor research and development, it's not just about innovation. It's about making sure America stays ahead of China and Russia in nuclear technology. When you see supply chain initiatives, it's not just about reducing costs. It's about reducing dependence on countries that might have different interests. That's the bigger picture. Energy, economy, and national security are intertwined, and the policy response reflects that. Now, that doesn't mean everything in these orders is uncontroversial. There are legitimate debates about nuclear safety, about waste disposal, about the pace of regulatory reform, about whether the targets are realistic. But the strategic direction is clear. Nuclear energy is back as a priority in American energy policy. And it's not just nuclear, it's also renewables. It's also grid modernization. It's also supply chain development. It's also workforce training. It's a comprehensive approach. Whether it succeeds will depend on execution. Will Congress fund it? Will the supply chain expand fast enough? Will the regulatory reforms actually work? Will developers build projects? Will communities accept them? Will the financing come together? Those are the questions that matter now. The policy framework is in place. The targets are set. The mechanisms are being established. Now comes the hard part, actually building it. And that's the story we'll be watching over the next 5 to 10 years. Because if this works, if Illinois gets its 2 gigawatts of new nuclear, if the federal targets start being met, if the supply chain expands, if the grid is modernized, then America's energy future will look fundamentally different from what it looks like today. That's not prediction. That's already in motion. We're just watching it happen.
Let the future be